Good morning, everyone. We are about to get started here. Going to give it a couple more minutes. And just double checking, Kristen, you can still see the screen, correct? Okay, great. It's 10:01. Welcome, everyone. We'll give it just a couple more minutes. Got about 33 showing up now. And for those of you just logging on, go ahead and introduce yourself. Say hello in the chat. We are getting ready to start here in a couple minutes. We'll get started about 10:03, 10:04. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's office hours. My name is Anthony Zepeda. I'm with the ESG annual team, and we're going to go ahead and get started on our slides here. Please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, and we will be also addressing questions in the chat throughout the presentation today, so you can also put your questions there. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started. Our agenda for today, we're going to give a very brief ESG update and some of the resources available. Connie is going to give an update on the HP NOFA and status of some of the applications that have come in. We'll have updates on the ESG CV team and general office hour updates, the ESG CV Q&A, and then for our spotlight session today, it's going to be a toolkit of best practices to advance racial equity. Got a great team of presenters today. It should be a great session. In terms of ESG updates, yesterday was it. Yesterday was the last day for 2021 contracts. So hopefully you got everything in, and as we scramble to get that all processed in time. And for the 2022 ESG awards, hang in there. They're coming in slow and steady. It's a trickle. Hopefully it's going to speed up to more of a roar here pretty soon, but contracts has been a little backed up due to a lot of new contracts coming in, but just keep checking your notifications and your emails in eCivis. For the 2023 ESG annual NOFA, applications are due just around the corner, 10/16. So please, if you're going to apply, get online, get on eCivis, and send in your application. And along the way, if you have questions, you can always reach out to your team representatives, Diana Prado, Sam Liu, Giovanni Martinez, Tuesday Cool, and myself. And if you can't reach us, or you just want to double check and make sure everything is marked off, you can also email the ESG NOFA inbox. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Connie, who's going to give a quick update on the HP NOFA. Connie?
Thank you, Anthony. Good morning, everybody. I wanted to take this opportunity to just remind folks that have homelessness prevention applications in draft. We're seeing a lot of draft applications out there, and that was for this one-time special homelessness prevention NOFA that we released not too long ago. Just want to remind those that have draft policies and procedures, as everybody knows, you have to have them approved by HCD, that we won't begin reviewing those until you hit the submit button for the application. So I want to make sure everybody's not assuming that if their application is sitting in draft status, we aren't going to go in and look and see if you have draft policies and procedures. So if you have draft policies and procedures and you have everything else in line, then be sure you hit the submit button in eCivis, and that will be our cue to go in and start reviewing, and then we'll see that you have draft policies that we will begin reviewing, and we will certainly notify you. So I just want to make sure everybody was aware of that. And if you have any questions, you can either reach out to me, or the ESG NOFA box is probably the best way, and then I will be sure and respond to any questions you have as soon as possible. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it back over to LaQuantia.
Thank you, Connie. And now for our ESG CV closeout process. We have already passed our deadline for expenditures, which included all of our program components: street outreach, emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, and rapid rehousing. That deadline was September 30th. So hopefully all of your program funds have been expended as of today. Remember that your drawdown deadline is November 15th, and that agreements expire on December 31st. As for our HMIS and admin components, the expenditure deadline for those are October 31st, and the drawdown deadline is the same, November 15th. Any of our communities that received additional funds, your expenditure deadline of those additional funds is March 31st, and the drawdown deadline is April 15th. Next slide. As part of the ESG CV closeout process, subrecipients must submit a final request for funds. Subrecipients will need to complete an ESG CV certificate of completion form after the final RFF is completed. Your grant administrator will be able to assist you with this process. Next slide. And HMIS closeout. Clients should be exited from the ESG CV program in HMIS on October 1st, 2023, after street outreach and emergency shelter program funds expire, or a date earlier when the clients are no longer in the program. The HMIS lead will continue to submit the HMIS SAGE bundle reports through the quarter ending December 31st, 2023. The HMIS lead will also submit SAGE HMIS bundles for additional funds up through the quarter ending June 30th, 2024. So remember, although your expenditure deadlines will come before, you have to finish submitting those reports. Just make sure you submit those reports through those ending dates. Next slide. Do we have any questions about anything right now?
We do have one question, and I'm not sure if it's for Tony or for Connie, so I'm just going to throw it out there for HCD, and y'all can figure out who it's for. From Deidre, just confirming we can submit a draft resolution and provide an updated one once it's approved for fiscal year 23 NOFA.
So I'll go ahead and jump in there. So we do have two NOFAs out there. So for the 2023 annual NOFA that everybody, that we put out every year, you can submit a draft resolution. Just keep in mind that if you're awarded, you would not get an executed contract until we have an approved authorizing board resolution. If you're talking about that one-time homelessness prevention NOFA that you submitted an application for, you can submit a draft resolution. However, this one-time HP NOFA, the applications are over the counter. So over the counter meaning first in, first reviewed, and first funded if it's all complete. So If you come in and let's say position number 3, when we get in, it's like, oh, they have, we see that you have a draft resolution, draft homelessness prevention policies and procedures. We will pull you out of line, email you saying this is what you're deficient in, and then you will go and fix those, whether getting your resolution completed and authorized, and then give us a chance to review your policies and procedures. And once those are approved by us, then you go back through the submission process again. So I hope that helps. Let us know if you have any more questions.
Thank you, Connie. I don't see any more questions at this moment, LaQuantia.
All right. Well, Chris, I'll turn it over to you for our Spotlight series.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. Thank you, LaQuantia, and welcome everyone today to this session. This is one that has been a labor of love for this group, for the team I'm getting ready to introduce for quite some time. We are introducing the toolkit of best practices to advance racial equity for the ESG program, developed by ICF and published by California Housing Community Development. So really excited to show that to you today. And really excited to introduce our next set of speakers. And next slide, please. Also, all authors. So everyone who had a hand in writing this, we're going to give a chance to introduce themselves. So Alyssa, would you mind kicking us off today?
Sure, I could do that. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's morning on the West Coast. My name is Alyssa Parrish. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a senior manager with ICF, and really excited about talking through this toolkit. And as Chris lovingly mentioned, the labor of love. So I'm excited to be here. I'll pass it over to Mary Frances.
Good morning from the East Coast. I'm Mary Frances Kenyon. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in Washington, D.C. and no longer, sadly, with ICF, but currently at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Great to be here, and I'll pass it over to Nitan.
So Nitan is not able to be with us today, but was definitely involved in the writing of this. So Nitan identifies he, him, his, white, and Jewish. Next slide, please. Melissa Michael, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Sorry, I don't know if my video is on. Melissa Michael, she, her pronouns, identify as Mexican American. I'm also with ICF, and I come to you from Fresno, California.
Kristen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Delkamp. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as white and Hispanic, and I'm coming to you from Orange County, California.
And last but not least, my name is Chris Pitcher. I also work for ICF. He and his pronouns identify as white, coming to you from Denver, Colorado today. So let's get into the content. Next slide. Mary Frances, would you like to kick us off, please?
I would love to kick us off. First, I'll start out by saying that the guidebook is not a definitive approach to advancing equity, but rather it serves as a starting point and resource for you all, regardless of where you might be in terms of working to advance racial equity. We want to support you all in that journey, again, wherever it may be. So you might be wondering, like, why equity matters? What's the difference between equality and equity? Well, in short, equality means that all people, regardless of their race or ethnicity or gender, disability, age, socioeconomic status, household type, so on and so forth, are provided with the same resources, pathways, or supports to access opportunities and or their goals. And the key difference is that equity is acknowledging the reality that different people are situated to opportunities differently based on some of those factors that I just mentioned. But specifically, when it comes to race and ethnicity, there are some systemic and institutional barriers at play. There are also features for like folks that identify as a part of the disability community, such as ableism, gender, sexism, and other circumstances. So most important note that I could ask for you all to remember is that without a deliberate focus on equity in your strategy development, in your funding decisions, you might unintentionally exacerbate existing inequities. Next slide, please. So developing a common language, and hopefully you'll find this part helpful in the toolkit, is really focused on the concept of race, If you all have been to one of the ICF trainings in the past over the last couple of years, we talked a little bit about how race was something that was socially constructed to really group and divide people based on skin color. It's been used historically to deny rights and justify social inequalities, which then contribute to some of the disparities or inequities that we see, particularly within the homeless response system. Even though the biological basis of race is not something that's real. It's not a scientific concept. And in fact, 99% of us is more alike than it is different. So even despite this, race is something that we've been conditioned to use as a way to classify ourselves, and how a person identifies racially or ethnically or culturally ranges across a spectrum. So there are some helpful points in the back of the toolkit. There is a bit of a glossary that you can refer to. But most importantly, if you had one takeaway from developing a common language, if you're uncertain, when in doubt, ask how people identify. This isn't something that is about getting it right or being perfect. It's just about being open to learning and growing and creating space for people to identify who they are for themselves. So we're hoping that you will definitely check this out. Another key takeaway from this slide is that while the focus of this toolkit is leading with racial equity very explicitly, that is not exclusively. The reason why we tend to lead with race and ethnic equity is because of the fact that there's always an overlay on disparities. So if you look at gender, for example, if you look at disability, race and ethnicity compound any disparities that one might experience, in addition to their other identities. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the state of California and racial disparity, although the history of like racial equity being more prevalent in our field, and us being open to have discussions along the lines of race and ethnicity and disability and everything in between, started out back in 2016 with a major nationwide study that was conducted that really surfaced some of the disparities. And I can say definitively that California has been one of the states across the country that has been on the forefront of looking into racial disparities. So this slide here just gives you a snapshot based on the most recent action plan executive summary data on who is experiencing homelessness. And I definitely won't steal my colleague's thunder, but I do want to just name this, that when you're looking at the toolkit, you'll see a pretty big emphasis on California specific data, but also being sure that you are looking not at just who's overrepresented in your homeless response system, but also looking at who might be underrepresented, because sometimes our data doesn't, our numeric data or our quantitative data doesn't paint a full picture of who's experiencing homelessness and why, who has access, who doesn't, and things like that. But we know that longstanding racist policies and practices have really concentrated marginalized communities in undervalued occupations, which can increase economic insecurity, which is one of the drivers of people experiencing homelessness. So what I'll say is that the numeric data, and there are some pretty powerful research studies that are featuring more and more stories of those with living experience of homelessness, both current and prior, folks of color that are more likely to experience housing instability, homelessness, be rent burdened, and things of that nature. So if you have any takeaways before I hand it over to one of my favorite colleagues in the whole wide world, just take a look at the toolkit. Everything may not apply for you as you navigate your community dynamics, but there should be something for everyone in this toolkit across a range of topics, as it relates not just to your ESG funding, or grantees, but for everyone. There's something there for everyone, and we hope that you'll take a look at it. We will have it featured towards the end of this presentation because I believe it is now live on the HCD website. That's enough out of me. I'll hang around for Q&A, and I am so excited to be handing this next portion of today's Spotlight series over to my good friend and colleague, Alyssa Parrish, who's going to give us the lowdown from the data perspective. Alyssa?
Thank you. You're also one of my favorite humans in the world. We're going to talk a little bit about the data. So we're going to focus on quantitative just because the homeless response system actually has a lot of quantitative data available to us, but also wanting to recognize and emphasize what Mary mentioned about the qualitative, like the stories piece, and actually getting that information, which we'll focus on a little bit more in a couple of slides, but just highlighting that here. So the first piece that we want to talk through is this COC Racial Equity Analysis tool. It was actually updated this month. So I'm going to drop the link into the chat for that. It includes the 2023 point in time count data, and then still the ACS data from 2017 through 21. So the updates are that it includes this year's, because we're still in 2023, this year's pit count data, whereas before it was including last year's. So that is updated as of this month. And it is a really great starting point. So as we talk through all of the different data that is available to us, I think just recognizing where the limitations are, because there is no single data set that is going to tell you all the things you need to know about your homeless response system, but there are several data sets available to us that tell us different pieces of that. So this one specifically does pull in that census data, both the total population and the poverty population, or those in poverty. And so that is a unique component of this specific tool. And it does really highlight or focus on the point in time count. So that is the data that is specific to homelessness that is included in this tool. And we know that there are limitations with the pit count. You know them probably better than I do for your specific community, but it is a starting point to understand where those disparities show up based on the population in poverty and then based on your total population. So that is one type of data. And then if we go on to our next slide, this is where we really start to talk through, like, there is, I call it no one report to rule them all. So if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you know where that comes from. We have a lot of different data sets available to us. I would say HUD is ahead of the curve within the federal government of collecting quantitative data to really understand how the programs that they're funding are really operating and serving people. So I'm just going to go through each of these at a really brief clip. At this point, there's way more information about these reports in the Racial Equity Toolkit, but really highlighting that none of them are going to tell you all the things. So your point in time count obviously has to be done within the last 10 days of January. And it is just a count on a single night of people experiencing homelessness in your community. It does include typically both a sheltered and an unsheltered count. So in some communities, this is the most comprehensive count of unsheltered homelessness that they have. So there are some reasons why people still focus on the point in time count, and there are still some use cases for it, but there are definitely limitations. It's one night out of an entire year. There are a lot of factors that go into who might be experiencing homelessness on that single night. You know, there's the piece around comprehensive coverage for unsheltered counts and really participation at the shelter count level. So that is the PIC count. The housing inventory count, or the HIC, supplements your point in time count, happens on the same night as your PIC count, and really looks at the number of beds dedicated to people experiencing homelessness across your COC or your community. So that should include both HMIS participating and non-participating projects. And this is just a count of capacity or beds available. I think the limitations are this doesn't include affordable housing. So it really includes those that are dedicated specifically to people experiencing homelessness, which is going to exclude some beds that may be in use for people experiencing homelessness, but may not be dedicated. The LSA, or the longitudinal systems analysis, and then Stella P, or Stella Performance, looks at the system level some specific performance measures. So I call them the big three that are captured or Stellavized through the LSA. That's looking at the length of time households experience homelessness, the exits to permanent destinations and other destinations for households, and then households that return to the homeless response system after exiting. So the LSA reports at the household level. It is a system level report. It isn't looking at it at the data at the project level. It is looking at it at the system level. I think the limitations with the LSA are that they don't include specific project types. So the LSA does not include homelessness prevention, street outreach, and coordinated entry projects specifically. And I know that in some communities, those are really big components of the homeless response system that are just absent from the LSA. So if we go to the next slide, most communities have what they would call like a coordinated entry prioritization list or by name list. And those communities also, most of them, have that information housed within their HMIS. The way that this looks and the way that this functions is really specific to every community. We just went through a data standards process, right? We're in fiscal year 2024 at this point. In effective October 1, there were new data elements and data standards in place. If you are part of that HMIS world, you know that there was a lot of discussion about the idea or potential of shifting the coordinated entry data from 4.19 or coordinated entry assessment and coordinated entry event to coordinated entry activity. And after a lot of discussion and conversation and seemingly like last minute decisions, that was rolled back. So we still are collecting data related to coordinated entry under coordinated entry assessment and event today, with the understanding that that will shift probably in fiscal year 2026. But how that data interacts with a community's prioritization list or by name list is really specific to each community, which is why looking at what data we collect for the purposes of coordinated entry across the country is so difficult, because communities have established coordinated entry very locally and based on their context, which they should, because that's how it's going to be most relevant and effective. But it makes it difficult then to understand, like, what data do we collect at the national level to understand how coordinated entry is operating in these different communities. So depending on how your coordinated entry prioritization list or by name list looks, it may include different types of information, who's prioritized, you know, what household types, and then if you're able to disaggregate that by race, ethnicity, gender, household type, those kind of demographics are really dependent at the local level. System performance measures are similar to the LSA in that they report at the system level, but the system performance measures report at the client level, not the household level. So it does report on similar performance measures like length of time experiencing homelessness, total number of people experiencing homelessness, access to permanent destinations, and returns. The system performance measures do include street outreach projects for a couple of the measures, but it still does not include like coordinated entry as a project type, for example. So it does look at performance. System performance measures don't disaggregate that information by race and ethnicity and other demographic information, which is a huge issue. Some communities have locally figured out how to do that, but it's not a consistent requirement across the board. And then the CSC race and ethnicity analysis tool, which we went over at the beginning, that is one of the only tools, at least published by HUD, that is available that includes census data as a comparison point. So if we go to the next slide, there's also victim services provider data potentially, ideally available to you and your community. That data has to live outside of HMIS per the Violence Against Women's Act, but ideally, you know, as part of your homeless response system, there are connections there that you can, at least at the aggregate level, receive that information and start to understand, you know, are there really big differences between people that are being served by VSPs versus our, you know, typical homeless response system, or are there similarities? Are there ways that we can streamline services between and among those different systems because we know that there's a lot of overlap in who is served in both of those. And then we have our APRs, so our annual performance reports, our CAPRs, or consolidated annual performance and evaluation reports, and other project level reports. And those really are at the project level. So fiscal year 2024 did see some incorporation of equity-based questions into the APR and CAPR specifications. It's a starting point. It's not great. Mostly because of the structure of the APRs and CAPR. The APR and CAPR are not client level reports, right? They're aggregate level. And so you can only do so much with equity metrics when you are working with an aggregate level report. But there are, I think, 3 or 4 questions that very specifically look at things like length of time experiencing homelessness and exits to permanent destinations. And I think there's one other that is disaggregated by race ethnicity, which is the first time that has happened with the APR and CAPR. So that's exciting. So as you see, all of these different reports actually look at data in different ways and tell you different things about your homeless response system. So that's why there isn't one report to rule them all. There really is many that will show you different pieces of the whole. And if we go to the next slide, just real quickly highlighting that there are other types of data. So system mapping, looking at how your system is set up today and the different pathways that households and or individuals kind of access your homeless response system. System mapping is based on how your homeless response system functions today. System modeling, that next one, is looking at how your homeless response system could function in an ideal state. So it's looking at what do you need to resolve, address, and end homelessness in your community if you were working from an ideal world. There's also non-homeless data. So we talked about how census data is pulled into the race equity analysis tool, but there's also different uses and different types of data that communities have looked at intersecting with their homeless response system data specifically to look at, like, there are communities doing really cool stuff with predictive analytics to understand who might experience homelessness, and are there upstream ways or proactive measures that we can take to make sure that they don't actually experience homelessness, or, you know, different ways in which communities are looking at prioritizing folks through coordinated entry by leveraging some of these non-homeless data sets like hospital, emergency services, criminal justice system, child welfare, different data sets like that. And then going back to what Mary Frances mentioned around the qualitative data. So the quantitative, all of these numbers, all of the number data is going to tell you what is happening in your homeless response system, but that number data is never going to tell you why the disparities are showing up in your system. So really bringing in that qualitative information. We've done a lot of focus groups, interviews, surveys to really understand, you know, like one of the questions that's coming up a lot right now is, who is prioritized through your homeless response system for the purposes of coordinated entry? Well, we can look at the data, right? We can look at the data and see what the data is telling us, but that's only going to tell us one part of the story. Asking people who have navigated that homeless response system themselves, who have gone through the coordinated entry process themselves and both been housed through that process, but also not been housed through that process, understanding their experience through that system is really important and helps contextualize the numbers. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to talk really quickly about targeted universalism, which is a framework within which you can do some of this data analysis. So there are 5 steps of targeted universalism. You're really establishing a universal goal that you are trying to achieve for an entire population. You then assess how the entire population is doing related to that universal goal. And we're going to go through an example here in a minute. I'm just going through the steps right now. Assess performance of the entire population related to that universal goal. Then we start to look at how are different subpopulations performing related back to that universal goal and related back to the overall population. So this step is important because I think it's a pivot from the way that we have historically done data analysis. So I used to compare, like, how are Black households doing compared to Asian households, or how are Asian households doing compared to Hispanic Latinx households? And that this step through targeted universalism also asks us to look at how are Black households doing compared back to our universal measure of, say, average length of time experiencing homelessness. Rather than comparing just against or between different subpopulations, we also want to look at how are folks doing compared back to that universal measure, because that'll show and highlight different pieces of disparities that could exist. The assess and understand is really where we're bringing in that qualitative information. We need to understand why the numbers are what they are, why they're telling us what they're telling us, to be able to create the effective strategies that we then develop and implement to address the disparities and reach our universal goal. So we go to the next slide. I think this shows an example of targeted universalism. So because we are dealing with our homeless response system, I mean, a lot of communities are looking at, we want to reduce the length of time people are experiencing homelessness in our system, right? We want to reduce that length of time. That's a great universal goal. That's a goal that we want for everybody who accesses our homeless response system, regardless of, how they came into our system. So that's establishing that goal. We're establishing the fact that we want to reduce the length of time people experience homelessness in our system. Then we're going to assess how our entire homeless response system is doing related to that universal goal. So we're going to say right now, and this could be your system performance measure, this could be your Stella P, average length of time experiencing homelessness, like whichever measure makes the most sense for you to leverage to be your universal measure for your entire population of people that you're trying to serve. So we're going to say in this example, our average length of time everyone in our homeless response system is experiencing homelessness is 100 days. So then we need to look at how different folks or different subpopulations are doing related back to that universal goal. So I'm going to say I'm looking at American Indian, Alaska Native folks specifically, and their average length of time experiencing homelessness is actually an average of 200 days instead of that universal measure of 100 days. How everyone is doing in our system. That's an issue, right? That's a disparity. We need to understand why that is the case. So then in our assess and understand, we're looking at, okay, we're seeking qualitative information. We're doing some interviews, some focus groups, some surveys, and come to find out that a local tribal nations actually provides a banking and lending service for their tribal members. But that specific service is not captured in, the big three credit scores. And so that is impacting people's ability to access rental units because the credit scores are not being impacted by this great banking and lending system that the local tribal nations has, but it's not being captured. So it's not impacting their scores positively. And because credit scores are often looked at or part of assessment when you apply for a rental unit, it's impacting them negatively. And so then what we do is we develop and implement a strategy that can directly impact this specific reason that we have found. Now, recognizing that, yes, we found this because American Indian Alaska Native people are experiencing homelessness for a longer period of time, and this is the reasons that we found for why they are. But developing and implementing a strategy like working with landlords to accept other forms of credit or working at a higher level to use any type of credit as a screening point for rental applications, that impacts more than just American Indian Alaska Native people. It impacts them for sure, but it could also impact other folks that have other ways that they have navigated, forms of credit or navigating different types of credit that may not impact their scores. So that is the targeted piece of this, but that's also the universalism piece of these effective strategies. I think I'm handing it off to Melissa. That was my piece.
That is correct. Thank you, Alyssa. So we're going to go into now from meaningful engagement to authentic partnership, which is a great piece in the toolkit. And as Alyssa was talking about, getting the voices of those who have gone through the system, who may have been housed through the system. So we know that to eliminate homelessness and housing insecurity, it is important to ensure that the voices of people with lived experience are at the forefront of the research, the policy, the advocacy, the training, and the collaboration that we do. We also know this can only take place through an established process that starts with meaningful engagement and develops into a deeper, authentic partnership. And the toolkit goes through, the process of that. So the steps of the process are developing an action plan for engagement, establishing a flexible compensation policy for people with lived experience, providing ongoing training and support, creating a continual feedback loop process for quality improvement, and integrating people with lived experience, not only to come at the table, but integrating them into the workforce, to a board of director position, system planning. So again, all of this can help foster authentic partnership, which provides welcoming spaces, that offers individuals more opportunities to participate, and also to create more equitable systems in our community. Next slide, please. So as we look at developing a plan for engagement, we want to look at creating an action plan. And it is best that a community understands what is and is not working when it comes to engagement for people with lived experience and their experience through the system. So this is going to mean digging into, survey results of an assessment, to uncover the community, COC, or organization strengths and weaknesses, and identify areas for improvements. So the focus on this should be on the feedback received. And we're looking at the assessment. We want to pay attention to themes or patterns in the results. Once we have completed the assessment, it's time to decide where to focus our efforts. So again, as a team, we want to review the results and list the key focus areas so that we know what we would like to explore further. And these focus areas will be the starting point for brainstorming actionable takeaways. Next, we want to create focus groups that include people with lived experience assigned to each focus area from the assessment. So we want to ensure that we also provide people with lived experience the context, the training, and the tools necessary to be a productive member of the focus groups, whether they're leading the focus groups or co-leading the focus groups as well. And the focus groups will work together to discuss what may be affecting the feedback of each question, identify possible challenges in addressing those issues, and brainstorming solutions. When we think of focus groups, they should not be like a normal meeting where we all just, sit around the table, but rather we want to look at finding ways to use it as an occasion to create an open dialogue that can challenge assumptions and incorporate diversity as well. Next slide, please. So then we want to take those ideas from the focus group as takeaways and start brainstorming on how to improve each focus area. So there's probably going to be, a long list of ideas. So the group will need to discuss which ones they like best, which ones we have capacity for, and narrow them down to a few possible solutions to act upon. When those solutions have been identified, it's time to commit to implementing the engagement action plan. As the action plan is defined, there are specific actions listed on this slide, also found in the toolkit, which will help with the accountability. Without clear commitment and accountability, we know a lot of times that our efforts towards a plan can dissipate over time. We lose motivation, or we get distracted by other priorities through the year. So having a way to come back to have that commitment or accountability will help us to make sure that we are continuing with the plan. One of the things that I do want to point out, and the toolkit goes into a little bit more, is the compensation policy. So when inviting people with lived experience in, we want to ensure that a flexible compensation policy is established. So from here on the slide, we're talking about discussing payment up front. A lot of this is going to be communication. When we talk with people with lived experience, again, that is going to be a conversation. We may be working with somebody who hasn't had a paycheck in a while. So the means that we're used to having as a paycheck, or just, automatic deposit into my bank, we need to find out is how feasible is that for those with lived experience. So our discussion should be individual and confidential because everybody's situation is going to be different. We want it to be respectful and sensitive. It's crucial that peers have all the details about payment processes that they need prior to making a decision about opportunities for engagement. So it may happen that somebody says, I'm okay, I don't feel comfortable participating even with receiving compensation, and that's okay. Expectations for specific roles should be shared, discussed, and agreed upon upfront. And we want to communicate again with those lived experience upfront and throughout this process. Identify any barriers within the organization specific to the provision of compensation. So also look at your organization. What can and you cannot do? Is cash payment an option within your organization? That's something else that you need to look at as well. Organizations should have all processes required for timely, consistent, and respectful compensation in place before the organization begins the recruitment and discussion process. And lastly, it's considered the gold standard to financially compensate people with lived experience for their work in alignment with the professional compensation for similar work. Again, people with lived experience are bringing in a different lens than those of us who haven't experienced homelessness working in the field. Next slide, please. So this right here is just looking at a continual feedback loop for quality process and improvement. I know we're running short on time, so you can go into this a little bit more on the toolkit, but giving and receiving feedback and is an essential piece in any process. However, the effort is insufficient if there are not systems created for continuous feedback. So the system for continuous feedback is a critical step to sustaining lived experience engagement efforts. And then there's 5 areas that you can look at a little bit more. So set reoccurring feedback meetings, use technology as an advantage, being transparent, setting clear goals and expectations, and making feedback anonymous. Again, it's listed on the slide, but the toolkit provides that in a little bit more detail too as well. But just wanted to point that out as well. And at this time, I believe I am now handing it over to Kristen.
Thank you, Melissa. So we have talked about some different ways that we are getting people involved, and I am now going to talk about how we're integrating people with lived experience and expertise into places where decisions are made. So there's lots of ways you can do it, but here are a couple of focus areas. First off, we can bring people in as storytellers. So this is a great way to have qualitative information make its way out to the public. So we can bring people in to tell their stories as people with lived experience and expertise at listening sessions, public testimony, interviews, focus groups, digital formats. And there is a great cultural significance to this as well. We can also bring people in as advisors. We gain a lot from having somebody share their story, and we can use that as a way to leverage our own knowledge as we build programs and to inform our work. We can bring people in as sub-recipients using federal agency funding to engage people with lived experience and expertise to inform the design and implementation of their work. So these could be agencies or organizations that are actually started by people with lived experience and expertise that are coming on board as funding partners. Partners that are external to the COC. So we've got partnerships that are for training and technical assistance, consultation, materials development, guidance, model policies, position papers, and white papers. And staff that are internal to the COC. They provide training, grant monitoring, ongoing consultation, coordination of discrete projects, mentoring, coaching, and collaborating with other people with lived experience and expertise. These are just some examples, but some good areas of focus for how we integrate people with lived experience and expertise into places where decisions are made. Next slide, please. Now, the toolkit is meant to be a useful document. So while there's a lot of information in it, there are also going to be activities, places where you can do activities so that you can work on racial equity in your own community. So I'm going to highlight one area, which is a people with lived experience and expertise action plan. So within the toolkit, you'll find goal areas. and this is one of them. I think there are 5 pages for goals, but you're able to develop your own community-based goal. So you would do some brainstorming and decide what goal you'd like to focus on. Keep in mind that even though there are 5 pages, there don't have to be 5 goals. You may decide that you want to spread it out over time. You determine your action steps that are necessary to reach your goal. You assign action steps to specific people, and hopefully you're bringing in people with lived experience and expertise as some of those assigned to folks. Entities are other people who need to be involved in the action step, but who may not be leading it. Your desired outcomes are the tracks that the action step has to take to be successfully achieved. Resources needed can be monetary, can be non-monetary resources, whatever you need to accomplish the action step. And the timeline. The timeline is not a deadline. It's the approximate order and priority in which the action step should be accomplished to meet the goal. So these are meant to be useful tools within the toolkit itself that you can utilize to increase racial equity in your own community. Next slide, please. Switching gears, we want to talk a little bit about tribal nations. I think we are aware that Native and Indigenous peoples and their history in California dates back thousands of years. There are currently 109 federally recognized tribal nations and 65 tribes in the state of California, making California home to more Native American residents than any other state in the US. A tribe is considered a socio-political entity with its own cultural sphere where people are connected by language, culture, and traditions. Traditionally, the history that has been taught and written by non-Indigenous peoples does not adequately reflect the atrocities experienced by Native and Indigenous peoples. An example of this in California can be the mission culture. To address the housing needs of Native American tribes, the California legislature passed Assembly Bill 1010 in 2019. This requires California HCD to meaningfully address access and participation of tribal nations and tribes to HCD funding programs. So you'll see tribes are now involved in ESG-CV and ESG and other programs. ESG subrecipients and sub-subrecipients are encouraged to practice responsible engagement when collaborating with tribal communities in their area. Next slide, please. Here we've got some tips and information on interacting with tribal communities. And I think that a lot of these are common sense, but at the same time, really important areas of focus, including things like when arranging meetings, ask for the tribe's preference regarding the setting of the meeting. Do they want it to be virtually or in person? If a meeting is going to take place virtually, where video is an option, make sure you're leaving your camera on the entire time. Ask how to address a representative of a tribal nation, a tribe, or a tribally designated housing entity. During meetings with the tribal community, use clear language. What we mean by that is minimize acronyms. That's something we should do in all of our meetings. Be clear on roles and responsibilities, practice active listening, and be mindful of our tone and words. Learn how to read the room by understanding the meaning of silence and body language, and also be comfortable with silence and body language. There are more tips here, and I wanted to point out that California HCD also has created a Tribal Nations Engagement Toolkit that subrecipients can refer to for additional education and support. This is just on the verge of being published, and we'll be very excited to release that and have more information about that soon. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Pitcher, and he's going to provide some more information and take us home. Thanks,
Thanks,
Chris.
Kristen. And thanks, everyone, for sticking around. I'm going to go through these next few slides in pretty quick detail. But one of the ways we think about equity is through procurement. Who has access to the funding? Who has access to be around the table to make those decisions? As continuums of care, you're required to provide the public invitations to join, to be inclusive, and participate. You want to strive for participation from a variety of agencies. That could be those that are culturally specific around experiencing homelessness, like folks who work with people of color or with our indigenous population, as Kristen was just mentioning. So we have a few tips for procurement. Understand your provider universe and geographic gaps. Perhaps you're a large county, there's pieces that are maybe indigenous or other folks that you don't work. Make those inroads, make those connections. Establish procurement goals. In this procurement, we want to have at least one culturally specific organization apply and receive funding. And then we'll grow upon that over time. Use plain language, describe our services without jargon. When I try to explain the COC to someone who doesn't know what the team of care is, it is very difficult. It's not logical. It has been made over years and is very complex. So try to avoid that jargon and make it as simple as possible. Make sure to divide your services so smaller organizations can remain competitive. A lot of these organizations are not the normal folks who come in for your funding in homeless services, and you want to find ways to engage them. So reach out to them directly and give pre-bid conferences. This is what we're looking for in the application. Be very, very clear. And then support those relationships. Perhaps you can have one of your smaller organizations work with one of your more established organizations to build that internal infrastructure. We really want to see folks have an opportunity to be at the table. Next slide. So this is just an overall recap of what we've talked about, creating open dialogues. Alyssa talked about analyzing the data, certainly engaging persons with lived experience in a meaningful manner, not tokenizing. And then support atypical community partners, really reach out there. This is in the document and really a summary of all the things that has been said before. Next slide. We are there. This is the toolkit. It exists on California HCD's website, thanks to a large effort from Connie Malavia and the folks behind the scenes getting this up in time for this presentation. We're very, very, very excited that is up. Someone will stick this in the chat, I'm sure, while I'm talking. And with that, we have just a few minutes left to have conversation. Should you have anything you'd like to say, go ahead and just come off mute, give us a holler, ask a question, or just make a comment. We'd love to see you and hear you. I don't think that can happen in this format, can it? Nope. Ask your question and I'll go ahead and raise it should you have it. And we did just put that in the chat. Thank you, Kristen, for putting that in there. But anyone have anything they'd like to say or think? You might need time to review the document. I want to say one last thanks to all our authors that are here today and those that aren't able to be with us today. Yeah, any comments from the rest of the group before we wrap up? Mary, Alyssa, Melissa, Kristen? No? Okay. I'm seeing no questions, and that is absolutely fine. So with that, I will hand it back to LaQuantia to do any closeout we might have. I don't think we have any closeout today, but I'll give you a chance. Oh, wait, hold on. We have a COC NOFA related question. I'm going to throw this out there. I don't know if anyone, maybe Mary Frances, you can answer this. It's a COC NOFA related question. As you know, we don't read the COC NOFA. Can you please clarify if the question asking if our COC has a victim service provider database is asking if our COC has just one VSP? I think the answer is no, but that is very oddly worded. So do you have any comments on that?
I mean, based on my experience completing the COC NOFO, I would say no. It's just asking if you have like a comparable database for all of your victim service providers.
Yeah, I think that's right. Is the COC outcomes by race and ethnicity Excel worksheet required to be part of the NOFA application? The template is under files in eCivis. By the application only asks the COC racial equity analysis tool from HUD would be uploaded. We want to confirm that the HMIS COC outcomes by race and ethnicity file is also required to be uploaded. I'm not sure I understand that question, Amanda. Yeah, you might need to send that.
Shoot it over to the NOFA email. We'll take a look at it.
Thanks, Tony. just going to say that was a follow-up question. Thanks, Amanda. With that, I don't think we have anything else to say today other than thank you. And please do jump in and read that document and let us know if you have